Alcatraz has been back in the headlines recently, with talk of repurposing the island prison for modern illegal immigrant detention, pending hearings and deportations. But long before it became a political symbol, it was home to some of the most infamous criminals in American history, the most famous probably being Chicago mobster Al Capone. Alcatraz is located on Alcatraz Island in San Francisco Bay, some 1.5 miles off the coast of California. First used as a jail during the American Civil War, Alcatraz became a federal penitentiary in 1934. But there was another inmate who became a legend and the subject of the feature film The Birdman of Alcatraz, which hit theaters in 1962. It was a fictionalized, almost sterile version of the life of a very interesting man. Who was Robert Stroud? How did he get to Alcatraz? What made him famous? Hello, I'm Colin Heaton, former history professor, Army and Marine Corps veteran, and welcome to this episode of Forgotten History. Robert Stroud was born on January 28, 1890, in Seattle, Washington, where he endured a troubled childhood under a very abusive father. At 13, he ran away from home and landed in Alaska. By the time he was 18 years of age, he had a relationship with a dance hall girl named Kitty O'Brien, who was rumored to be a prostitute, and Stroud may have been her pimp. In 1909, O'Brien was allegedly beaten by an acquaintance, possibly a customer or even a jealous suitor, and Stroud shot and killed the man. It was also rumored that Stroud killed the man for refusing to pay. He was later convicted of manslaughter and sentenced to 12 years at McNeil Island Penitentiary in Washington State, beginning his 54 years behind bars. Stroud developed a reputation of being a very violent and disruptive prisoner, to include homosexual assaults against other inmates. He once assaulted a hospital orderly and stabbed a fellow prisoner, receiving an additional 6 months to his sentence. In 1912, Stroud was transferred to Leavenworth Federal Penitentiary in Kansas as inmate number 8154. On May 25, 1916, his younger brother came for a visit but was not allowed to see him due to a disciplinary action after a corrections officer named Turner took Stroud's name and inmate number for an infraction. Later, Stroud entered the cafeteria the next day on March 26, 1916, where Turner was posted, and he asked permission to speak with him. Stroud asked Turner if he had reported him to the warden, as Officer Turner had taken his name and number the previous day. Officer Turner told Stroud that he had not yet reported him, but Stroud still stabbed Turner in the heart, killing him using a sharpened case knife, with about 1,500 other inmates in the dining area being witnesses. Stroud had 3 separate trials for the murder, 2 being hung juries in 1918, with a verdict of guilty announced in the 3rd and final trial, and Stroud was sentenced to be hanged. Stroud apparently showed no remorse for the killing, writing, "The guard took ill and died all of a sudden. He had a heart condition, puncture of the heart. There was a knife hole in it." One amazing outcome was that, due to Turner being very popular with the inmates, as he was perceived as being fair in his treatment, the inmates requested permission from the warden to donate $400 to Turner's family. Stroud's mother then appealed to President Woodrow Wilson, who commuted his sentence to life imprisonment. But Leavenworth's warden at the time, T.W. Morgan, strongly opposed the decision, citing Stroud's reputation for violence. President Wilson's Attorney General, Alexander Mitchell Palmer, saw to it that Stroud would spend the rest of his life in solitary confinement and not be executed. During a break in the prison yard in 1920, Stroud came upon a fallen nest with 3 baby sparrows. He took the birds back to his cell, sparking his longtime fascination with ornithology, and was allowed to keep the birds as a hobby. He developed his interest in ornithology at Leavenworth, which would create his legend. Despite having had no formal education after 13, Stroud became self-educated. Stroud enrolled in several university extension courses in mechanical drawing, engineering, music, theology, and mathematics, but he never abandoned his violent methods. Stroud began reading every book he could acquire on the subject of birds and science and recorded his own observations on behavior and illnesses that the books failed to cover. He was granted permission to raise and breed canaries and reached a point to where he had 300 of them living in cigar boxes in an adjoining cell. He became self-taught as a scientist and built a makeshift laboratory to develop homemade medicines for them, which he sold via mail order. His research into diseases and creating remedies were later considered groundbreaking. The other prisoners were sometimes allowed to buy the canaries that Stroud raised, which he sold for supplies and to help support his mother. Stroud himself said that he used a razor blade and nail for tools and made his first bird cage out of wooden crates. Not long after this, William Biddle took over as the warden of Leavenworth. Biddle was determined to turn Leavenworth into a model federal prison, creating what he saw as a progressive rehabilitation penitentiary. He saw Stroud as the tool to start its project. Biddle was impressed with Stroud's raising of the birds and his using fellow prisoners in his research, as he kept detailed notes on all of his avian activities, and he furnished Stroud with cages, chemicals, and stationery to conduct his ornithological activities. Visitors to the prison were shown Stroud's aviary, and many people purchased his canaries. Over the years, he raised nearly 300 canaries in his cells. He also wrote 2 full books, the 60,000-word treatise Diseases of Canaries in 1933, which managed to be smuggled out of Leavenworth, and then submitting a later edition titled Stroud's Digest on the Diseases of Birds in 1943 with updated specific information containing many of his own personal drawings. Stroud also made several important scientific contributions to aviation pathology, most notably developing a cure for the hemorrhagic septicemia family of diseases within certain bird species, thereby gaining recognition and immense respect from the international scientific, zoological, biological, and ornithological communities. But Stroud's growing popularity actually created serious problems for the prison staff due to the amount of fan mail and professional inquiries he received, since, per regulations, each letter sent or received in or out of the prison had to be read, copied, and approved. Stroud's correspondences soon required a full-time prison secretary. But there was also another problem, since most of the time his birds were permitted to fly freely within his cells. Because of the great number of birds he kept, his cell was filthy, creating a possible health issue. As a result, in 1931, there was an attempt to terminate his business and get rid of the birds. But Stroud got lucky, as one of his mail correspondents, a bird researcher from Indiana named Delamay Jones, made his story known to newspapers and magazines around the nation, and even in Europe. What followed was a massive letter campaign and a 50,000 signature petition being sent to President Herbert Hoover, which resulted in Stroud being permitted to keep his birds, and despite prison overcrowding, he was even given a second cell to house them. However, feeling defeated, the prison officials restricted his letter-writing privileges. But despite this, Jones and Stroud became close, and she relocated to Kansas in 1931 and started a business with him, selling his bird medicines. The prison officials were finally fed up with Stroud's activities and the unwanted publicity, so they intensified their efforts to transfer him from Leavenworth. However, Stroud discovered a Kansas law that forbade the transfer of prisoners who were married in Kansas, and he married Jones by proxy, which infuriated the prison's administrators, who would not allow him to correspond with his wife. But the prison officials were not alone in their anger. His own mother, Elizabeth Stroud, strongly disapproved of the marriage, believing women were nothing but trouble for her son. Whereas previously she had been a strong advocate for her son, helping him with legal battles, she now argued against his application for parole and became a major obstacle in his attempts to be released from the prison system. After moving away from Leavenworth, she had no further contact with him, and she died in 1938. In 1933, Stroud advertised in a publication that he had not received any royalties from the sales of his book, Diseases of Canaries. In retaliation, the publisher, who did not want to pay Stroud, complained to the new warden, and as a result, proceedings were then initiated to transfer Stroud to Alcatraz, where he would not be permitted to keep his birds. But Stroud's luck ran out when it was discovered that some of the equipment he had been using for his lab was in fact being used as a homemade distillery to manufacture alcohol. The officials finally had the wedge they needed to drive Stroud out. Citing his dangerous tendencies and long-standing concerns about the sanitary conditions of his cells, they initiated proceedings to send him to Alcatraz. In late 1942, Stroud was given 10 minutes to prepare for his transfer to the U.S. Penitentiary on Alcatraz Island, becoming inmate number 594. He was not allowed to have his birds in Alcatraz, so the birds, along with his research equipment, were sent to his brother. Upon arrival at Alcatraz, Stroud was still in isolation, but he continued writing, producing manuscripts on the history of the U.S. prison system and an autobiography, though he was denied permission to release them. He would spend 6 years in segregation and another 11 confined to the hospital wing at the penitentiary. In 1943, he was assessed by psychiatrist Dr. Romney M. Ritchie, who diagnosed him as a psychopath with an IQ of 112, which contradicted the initial Leavenworth assessment of his IQ in 1942, which stated that he had an IQ of 116. Rumors of Stroud's homosexuality were noted at Alcatraz. According to Donald Hurley, whose father was a guard at Alcatraz, whenever Stroud was around anyone, which was seldom, he was closely watched, as prison officials were very aware of his overt homosexual tendencies. In an interview with Hurley for his book, a former inmate heard Stroud was always in dog block, which is what they called solitary confinement, or later in the hospital, because he was a wolf, meaning an aggressive homosexual who had a bad temper. In 1955, Stroud was the subject of author Thomas E. Gaddis's well-received biography titled Birdman of Alcatraz. While detailing the prisoner's violent behavior, the book also painted him as a man fighting to maintain his dignity within exceedingly difficult conditions. Prison staff and fellow inmates described him as a manipulative and dangerous person. During his 17-year term at Alcatraz, Stroud was allowed access to the prison library and began studying law. Occasionally, he was permitted to play chess with one of the guards. Stroud began petitioning the government that his long prison term amounted to cruel and unusual punishment. While in Alcatraz, he wrote 2 more manuscripts, Bobby, an autobiography, and Looking Outward, a history of the U.S. prison system from colonial times to the formation of the Bureau of Prisons. A judge ruled that Stroud had the right to write and keep such manuscripts, but upheld the warden's decision to ban their publication. After Stroud's death, the transcripts were delivered to his lawyer, Richard English. In 1959, with his health failing, Stroud left Alcatraz and was transferred to the Medical Center for Federal Prisoners in Springfield, Missouri, but he was never released. In 1962, the feature film Birdman of Alcatraz, loosely taken from Gaddis's book, was released in theaters, featuring Burt Lancaster in an Academy Award-nominated role as a mild-mannered, reformed version of Stroud. The film was a commercial success, but it was not well received by those who knew Stroud. Some former inmates of Alcatraz say that the real Stroud was a far more sinister, dangerous, and unpleasant person than the fictionalized version portrayed in the book and film. One inmate said Stroud was a vicious killer. I think Burt Lancaster owes us all an apology. In February 1963, Stroud met and talked with actor Burt Lancaster, who portrayed him in the film. Stroud never saw the film or read the book it was based on, but he did share one of the problems that prevented parole, that he was an admitted homosexual. Lancaster quoted Stroud as saying, "Let's face it, I'm 73 years old. Does that answer your question about whether I would be a dangerous homosexual?" It was at Springfield where Stroud finally earned a reprieve from his long stay in solitary confinement, taking a job in the prison print shop. Stroud remained in the public eye and became even more famous after the book and film came out, but he had little time left. Despite the increased attention, Stroud was unsuccessful in his attempts to attain parole. He had been incarcerated for the last 54 years of his life, of which 42 were spent in solitary confinement. However, by his last years, Stroud's behavior had markedly improved, and he was viewed more favorably. Judge Becker considered Stroud to be modest, no longer a danger to society, and as having a genuine love for birds. Given his level of notoriety, the crimes he committed were unremarkable, especially as the assaults he committed had a clear cause. Carl Safakis considers Stroud to have been a brilliant self-taught expert on birds and possibly the best-known example of self-improvement and rehabilitation in the U.S. prison system. Because of Stroud's contributions to the field of ornithology, he gained a large following of thousands of bird breeders and poultry raisers who demanded his release, and for many years, a committee to release Robert F. Stroud campaigned to have Stroud released from prison. However, because Stroud had killed a federal officer, his punishment in solitary confinement remained intact. In 1963, Richard M. English, a young lawyer who had campaigned for John F. Kennedy in California, took the cause of securing Stroud's release. He also met with former President Harry S. Truman to enlist support, but Truman declined. He also met with senior Kennedy administration officials who were studying the subject. English actually took the last photograph of Stroud, in which he is shown with a green visor. The prison warden attempted to have English prosecuted for bringing something into the prison he did not take out, on exposed film, but the authorities declined to take any further action. Stroud also filed a lawsuit to have his manuscripts released, and the decision was still pending when he was discovered dead in his cell from natural causes on November 21, 1963, at age 73. Stroud was interred in the Old Masonic Cemetery near Metropolis, Illinois, after a private funeral ceremony at Aiken's Farmer Funeral Home on November 25th. His common-law wife had died earlier in February 1963. After Stroud's death, his personal property, including original manuscripts, were turned over to English, who was his last legal representative. English later donated some of the possessions to the Audubon Society. The manuscripts themselves went into probate, but his lawyer, Dudley Martin, sought to acquire them as administrator of the deceased inmate's will. He finally obtained the manuscripts in 1984 and tried to have them published, but publishing houses were very wary of potential lawsuits from former Alcatraz officers who may not be placed in a very good light in the book. After the statute of limitations passed, Looking Outward, A Voice from the Grave finally appeared in ebook form in February 2014. Among other details, the book reveals Stroud's homosexuality and the corruption rife among prison guards and wardens. With the movie rights sold and the promise of additional volumes on the way, it seemed likely the Birdman story would remain popular in the public's imagination. In fact, actor Art Carney portrayed Stroud in the 1980 TV movie Alcatraz, The Whole Shocking Story, and Dennis Farina played Stroud in the TV movie Six Against the Rock in 1987, a dramatization of the 1946 Battle of Alcatraz. Robert Stroud remains a controversial figure, a man whose intellectual pursuits and contributions to ornithology are juxtaposed against a backdrop of violence and lifelong incarceration. His story continues to provoke discussions about rehabilitation, the nature of criminality, and the complexities of human behavior. However, despite all of this, Stroud is still considered to be one of the most notorious criminals in American history. Robert Nemi states that Stroud had a superior intellect and became a first-rate ornithologist and author, but was an extremely dangerous and menacing psychopath, disliked and distrusted by his jailers and fellow inmates. Robert Stroud lives on in the legend of Alcatraz as an enigmatic and chimeric figure. Thank you for watching this episode of Forgotten History. If you liked what you saw, please click like, share, and subscribe. And if you would like to assist with the ever-increasing cost of production, please consider becoming a channel member and joining our Patreon page. Please check out our merchandise store. And thanks for watching.